Tokyo, August 15th, 1945. The air was heavy. The sun dimmed behind a veil of dust, and the city's shattered streets lay motionless. Only one sound broke the silence, the trembling voice of Emperor Hirohito, echoing from radios in homes, shelters, and alleyways. The war was over. Then, stillness. Men and women lowered their heads. Some wept quietly. Others stood frozen, staring at the ground in disbelief. Mothers held their children close, as if trying to shield them from a history too large to grasp. The unimaginable had been spoken. Japan had surrendered. In that moment, Tokyo changed. Among the ruins left by firebombs, families leaned toward their radios, absorbing every fragile word. The devastation was vast. More than 330,000 civilians without homes, nearly every district scarred by war. Yet the surrender struck deeper than the flames. It wasn't just the city reduced to ash, but a nation's pride. People exchanged silent glances. One question filled every mind. What will happen to us now? For years, the enemy had been portrayed as merciless, without compassion. In private, some whispered their fears of what might come. Yet beneath that dread, a fragile hope stirred. Perhaps the bombings would end, the sirens would fall silent, and children could finally see another sunrise. The mood was a strange blend of grief and relief. On one street, a shopkeeper quietly removed his military armband. On another, a boy traced a single word in the soot on a wall. Peace. But no one yet knew what kind of peace awaited them. The empire had fallen, and the victors were coming. 2 days after the emperor's broadcast, Tokyo trembled again, not from explosions, but from the rumble of engines. The first Allied convoys rolled into the city, steady and precise. Jeeps carried fluttering flags. Trucks were loaded with supplies. Soldiers marched in formation, their boots striking broken pavement in a rhythm the city had never heard before. Dust rose into the air as civilians watched from the ruins, eyes wide with uncertainty. Records later showed that nearly 150,000 American troops entered during the first phase of occupation. To those who had feared the worst, the sight was overwhelming. Streets filled with endless convoys, the symbols of victory shining in the sunlight. And yet, what people saw was not what they had imagined. The soldiers moved with discipline and order. They did not harm the civilians who watched from the rubble. Some vehicles even bore painted mascots and cartoon figures, absurd yet strangely human amid the wreckage. A man later recalled, "Their helmets seemed larger than life, not just for the steel, but for the confidence and strength they carried." Still, anxiety lingered. People waited for what might come next. Then, something unexpected appeared. In the back of certain trucks sat small figures, children. They laughed, pointed, and chatted. They were the families of officers, the children of those who had once been enemies. Civilians stared, stunned, in a city struggling to survive. The sight of smiling children from across the ocean brought a quiet, complicated mix of emotions, confusion, awe, and a reluctant sense of humanity returning to the ruins. The convoys did not just bring troops. As the days passed, Tokyo's civilians noticed something even more unsettling. The occupiers had arrived with their families, not just soldiers. Small groups appeared, women in neat dresses, children darting behind their fathers in crisp uniforms. To Japanese eyes, still accustomed to destruction, the scene felt surreal, as if the capital had become a stage set for an alien world. Reports confirmed that hundreds of dependents arrived in the early months of the occupation, a deliberate move by U.S. command to establish a sense of normalcy. But for ordinary civilians, who had endured years of deprivation, the effect was jarring. On streets, where children once carried empty rice bowls, American boys and girls now tossed baseballs, tugged at their mothers' skirts, or laughed freely. Their voices pierced the silence of mourning like sparks against embers. Witnesses later described the moment with disbelief. One woman, standing in the shadow of a burned-out tram car, whispered, asterisk, "How could they laugh here, where our sons died?" Asterisk. To her, the laughter was not innocent. It was a reminder of loss, of futures stolen. Each giggle clashed with memories of boys shipped to Manchuria, brothers lost at sea, or fathers buried in ash-filled urns. The contrast was unbearable, and yet impossible to ignore. As occupation forces took over government buildings and barracks, soldiers unloaded crates of supplies, while children ran between their legs, giggling at the strangeness of the rubble, pulling at twisted metal as if it were a toy. For families who had feared bayonets, this new reality was more complicated, a mix of humiliation and disbelief. The conquerors had not come to destroy Tokyo, but to live in it, unharmed, untouched by the war. The symbolism was undeniable. The war had consumed Japan's youth, while America's children had been sheltered by distance and industrial power. Now they stood in the heart of the defeated empire, their laughter rising above the ruins like a second declaration of victory. Civilians struggled to make sense of the noise. Was it cruelty, or simply the sound of a world they no longer belonged to? That question deepened when the same children appeared during moments meant for solemn reflection. On the 2nd of September 1945, Tokyo was still scarred and smoldering, but all eyes turned to Tokyo Bay, where the Japanese surrender was formally signed aboard the USS Missouri. Radios carried the ceremony across the city, and civilians gathered around, crackling speakers in silence. Flags were lowered, armbands removed, and the empire's final symbols faded into history. It was meant to be a moment of gravity, heavy with finality. Yet, in some occupied districts, another sound emerged: the laughter of American children. Witnesses recalled standing in streets where military police maintained order while Japanese civilians watched in stillness. From the steps of Allied offices or the backs of jeeps, bursts of giggling would rise, children amused by the uniforms, the flags, and the strange solemnity of the day. For many Japanese, that sound carried a difficult contrast. Families who had lost loved ones in faraway battles now heard the voices of the victors' children during a ceremony that marked the end of everything they had known. One man later reflected, "Our silence met their laughter. It wasn't that the children mocked, how could they understand? But in that moment, each laugh seemed to echo through the quiet of surrender. The numbers underscored the moment's weight. More than 2.3 million Japanese soldiers had died in the war, and countless families in Tokyo survived on less than 1,400 calories a day. Hunger and exhaustion shaped daily life. Against that, the sight of healthy, carefree children felt almost surreal, as if two separate worlds had met on the same ruined street. The symbolism was powerful. Where Japan's youth had been lost to war, America's children now stood on the soil of peace. Civilians felt not only the end of their nation's struggle, but also the beginning of a new reality, defined by contrast. The sound became unforgettable, a reminder that even in peace, the memory of loss could not be quieted. And as the echo of that laughter drifted through Tokyo's broken streets, people wrestled with a new question. How do we rebuild ourselves in a world where even innocence feels foreign? The answer would unfold in the days ahead, as shock gave way to reflection, a struggle that would shape Japan's identity for years to come. For Tokyo's civilians, the surrender was absolute. Flags fell, armies disbanded. Yet here were small, carefree figures skipping through the wreckage, proof that another world had survived intact. The contrast lingered in the minds of survivors. Mothers, clutching ration bags, watched in silence as foreign children laughed at swirling dust. By late 1945, official rations in Tokyo often dropped below 1,400 calories per day. Malnutrition spread quickly, and children could be seen in long lines for food or scraps. Against that, the sight of visitors' children playing freely, clean and untroubled, felt both comforting and painful. One eyewitness later wrote, "We struggled to stand while their children played." It was not resentment, but recognition of two nations emerging from war in very different conditions. Japan's families had given everything to the conflict, while across the ocean, life had continued. Psychologists would later call it cognitive dissonance, the clash of two realities that could not easily coexist. For the Japanese, it was the realization that while they mourned millions lost, others could already look toward the future with ease. Yet the paradox carried a quiet hope as well. Some mothers whispered that the laughter meant safety, that if the conquerors brought their children, then the violence had truly ended. In that fragile peace, emotions were mixed: sorrow, relief, uncertainty. But through it all, one truth emerged clearly. America's presence was not only military, but also cultural, and it was already reshaping the meaning of defeat and recovery. In the weeks that followed, convoys of food, gum, and chocolate would arrive, small tokens that hinted at a new chapter beginning amid the ruins of Tokyo. The shock of laughter was soon followed by something even more: overwhelming abundance on wheels. Within weeks of the surrender, Allied convoys pushed deeper into the city, their trucks stacked high with crates marked Times U.S. Army asterisk. Canvas covers flapped as tins of canned food, powdered milk, and chewing gum rolled through streets where families had survived on thin rice gruel. Civilians stared in disbelief as soldiers tossed ration tins aside, the metallic clatter echoing in neighborhoods where every grain of barley had been counted. Statistics reveal the scale. In the first year of the occupation alone, more than 4.5 million tons of supplies were shipped into Japan, a flood of flour, sugar, medicine, and cigarettes that seemed impossible to a nation with a shattered transport system and fields that had yielded only hunger. While Japanese children lined up with ration cards, American boys chewed gum until it lost flavor, then asked for more. The disparity was not just visible, it was humiliating. Witnesses remembered the bitterness. One woman later said, asterisk, "They had more sweets than we had rice." Asterisk. To the civilian mind, each crate symbolized more than food. It represented the truth that had won the war: industry, logistics, and production on a scale Japan could never match. Every Hershey bar and can of Spam was a quiet weapon, proof that America's factories had defeated the empire as surely as its soldiers. Children became the most unsettling messengers of this abundance. Japanese mothers holding ration bags of dried yams watched in silence as American kids popped gum, their jaws moving in cheerful rhythm. A simple act became a taunt, even if unintended. To civilians, it was as if the conqueror's children mocked scarcity itself, living proof that the war had been decided long before the last bomb fell. Yet, within the bitterness, another realization took hold. If America had so much that it could bring families, feed its soldiers luxuriously, and even provide candy to children, then Japan had no chance of rising against such power. The laughter that once wounded pride now merged with the sight of endless crates, creating a new form of surrender, cultural, not military. And this surrender carried its own sting, because it was witnessed every single day. The sting deepened as civilians began to see the conqueror's children, not just as strangers, but as symbols of a future Japan feared it had lost. For many in Tokyo, their presence soon became more than a curiosity. It became a haunting emblem. Their laughter was not just noise, it was evidence. Evidence that America had won more than the war. It had preserved what Japan had sacrificed the future. As Japanese families mourned sons who would never return, they saw enemy children running through the ruins as if it were a playground. The contrast burned into memory. Whispers spread through crowds. Asterisk. They still have generations untouched by war. Asterisk. One woman murmured as she watched a boy toss a ball beside a military truck. In her mind, it was undeniable. While Japan's youth had been consumed by battlefields and firebombs, America's youth had been shielded by oceans, protected by an industrial system that supplied both weapons and sweets. It was not just a military defeat, it was a generational one. The statistics reinforced the feeling. Japan's 66 major cities had been bombed, many to ash, while the American homeland remained virtually untouched by enemy attacks. Tokyo's civilians knew this instinctively, staring at the ruins around them while hearing stories of abundance across the Pacific. Each child who skipped through their streets became proof of that imbalance. Witnesses spoke in tones of humiliation. One man later said, asterisk, "Their innocence mocked our ruins. It wasn't the children's fault, but the symbolism was inescapable." Asterisk. Every laugh was a reminder of Japan's fallen empire. Every candy wrapper fluttering to the ground seemed to declare that the victors could protect even their most vulnerable, while the defeated could not. Mothers felt it most sharply. They saw their own children with hollow cheeks, ration bags clutched like lifelines, while across the street, American children were healthy, carefree, full of life. For civilians, the sight was unbearable and magnetic at once, a mirror of what they had lost and a glimpse of what might never return. But symbols had power beyond humiliation. Soon, people began recalling another comparison, one that cut even deeper. How Japanese soldiers captured abroad had been treated in Allied hands. If American children lived this freely, what had their captured fathers experienced overseas? That question would ignite a new layer of cultural shock. As the occupation settled in, another wave of humiliation crept into Tokyo's conversations. Whispers about how Japanese prisoners had been treated overseas. Civilians who had braced for brutality began hearing startling rumors. Asterisk. Our men in America played baseball. Asterisk. Someone said quietly in a market line. Another voice added. Asterisk. They ate meat every week. Asterisk. In a city surviving on thin rations and ash, these stories felt impossible. And yet they spread, passed from family to family, amplifying the shock already triggered by the sight of American children. The numbers were staggering. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners, German, Italian, and Japanese, had been held in camps across the United States. Unlike the emaciated figures returning from Japanese camps in Asia, many of these men had come back healthy, even heavier than when captured. Reports described organized sports, libraries, and regular meals of bread, vegetables, and meat. For Japanese civilians staring into half-empty bowls, the contrast was cruel. One man whose brother had been captured in the Philippines later muttered bitterly, asterisk, "Our soldiers lived like kings in enemy land." Asterisk. It was an exaggeration, but it captured the wound. Civilians had been told their warriors would die with honor, starving or fighting to the last breath. Instead, the truth was that some had survived the war in far better conditions than their families endured at home. This realization clashed directly with propaganda that had promised Americans would slaughter prisoners and enslave civilians. The very existence of healthy repatriated POWs became another shockwave of disbelief. Civilians now understood that the conquerors not only had more food, more trucks, and more children, they even treated enemy soldiers with a level of respect denied by their own officers. For mothers staring at laughing American children, the humiliation deepened. It was as if mercy had been extended everywhere except to them. They had buried sons, rationed rice to starvation levels, and endured nightly bombings, only to learn that their captured soldiers had eaten better than their own families. The sound of foreign laughter in Tokyo's streets now carried double weight. It was not just the symbol of victory, but of an inversion of everything Japanese civilians had believed about war. And that weight soon translated into something darker, the crushing sense of humiliation that saturated daily life. By autumn of 1945, humiliation had seeped into every corner of Tokyo. It wasn't just the ruins, the ration lines, or the surrender ceremonies. It was the daily sight of conquerors' children laughing in the streets. For men who had once bowed before the emperor's portrait and pledged their lives to the empire, that laughter cut deeper than battlefield defeat. It was constant, casual, and utterly indifferent to the grief surrounding it. Elders gathered near shrines reduced to rubble, lowering their heads as American children tossed balls between jeeps or skipped across cracked pavements. Each playful shout echoed against walls blackened by firebombs. To civilians, the sound was unbearable, a reminder of what had been lost and what could never return. Japan's next generation had been buried in Burma, on Saipan, at Iwo Jima. Yet America's next generation was here, whole, alive, and carefree. The numbers spoke louder than words. By war's end, an estimated 2.3 million Japanese soldiers were dead. Behind each number lay a household mourning a son, a father, or a brother. Entire villages had lost nearly every young man. Now, those same families looked across ruined streets and saw conquerors' children laughing where their own would never stand again. A diary entry from the time summed up the bitterness. Asterisk. We gave sons. They gave laughter. Asterisk. It wasn't hatred of the children, but the unbearable contrast of sacrifice versus survival. Japanese pride, already shattered by surrender, crumbled further under the weight of such scenes. Humiliation was not delivered by whips or bayonets. It arrived in the innocent laughter of children who had no idea of the pain around them. And yet, not all responses were the same. Some elders, watching silently, whispered that perhaps this laughter was also a strange kind of mercy. If conquerors brought children into Tokyo, maybe it meant no massacres, no more bombs, no annihilation of the civilian population. Shame and relief clashed in equal measure, leaving civilians caught between grief and gratitude. This paradox humiliation, mixed with unexpected relief, would shape the next stage of occupation life. For as civilians wrestled with these emotions, they began to realize that the very sound which wounded their pride might also guarantee their survival. At first, the sound of American children in Tokyo was unbearable, a chorus of innocence rising above the ruins. But slowly, another interpretation took hold. Civilians whispered in ration lines, in temple courtyards, in the shadows of burned-out houses. Perhaps the laughter was not mockery, but a signal. Asterisk. If conquerors brought families into the capital, then surely no massacre was coming. Asterisk, asterisk. If they laugh, maybe we live. Asterisk, one mother murmured to her neighbor, as children tugged at her sleeve for scraps. The relief was fragile, but undeniable. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as merciless. Many civilians expected slaughter after surrender, and some even prepared suicide plans rather than face the imagined brutality. Yet day after day, no executions came. Instead, the laughter of children drifted across checkpoints, a reminder that the victors felt safe enough to build lives here, not just enforce rule. The statistics support the shift. Despite the devastation of the war, historical records show no large-scale Allied atrocities against Japan's civilian population after surrender. Unlike the fate suffered in parts of Asia under Japanese occupation, Tokyo's civilians did not face mass killings. The occupation was firm, but it carried rules, discipline, and a strange degree of restraint. To families who had braced for the worst, that restraint felt almost miraculous. Still, the paradox stung. The very sound that wounded pride also carried reassurance. Civilians learned to read laughter differently, not as ridicule, but as evidence that survival was possible. Some began to tell their children, asterisk, stay near the Americans. It is safer. Asterisk. It was a reversal no one could have predicted months earlier when firestorms had turned districts into oceans of flame. One man wrote later in a notebook, asterisk, it was unbearable, but also mercy. Asterisk. The sentence captured the contradiction perfectly. Pride collapsed each time he heard the giggle of a conqueror's child, but fear of annihilation also eased. Tokyo's ruins still smoldered, but the city was alive, and its people would live on. From this fragile relief began the first steps toward adaptation. Civilians started watching not only what American children did, but how families lived their routines, their habits, their everyday comforts. And in those details, Tokyo began to glimpse what the occupation truly meant. By early 1946, the sight of American families in Tokyo was no longer a passing shock. It was part of daily life. Children appeared everywhere riding in truck beds, carrying schoolbooks to dependent classrooms, laughing as they played. Jazz music spilled from U.S. clubs, converted from old theaters, blending with the sound of American families. Civilians stood outside, listening as saxophones filled the night, a sound entirely foreign to ears accustomed to military marches. Inside, officers danced with wives while children played near bandstands. Their laughter slipped through broken windows into alleys where Japanese families queued for rations. The juxtaposition was jarring but impossible to ignore. Statistics reveal the reach of this transformation. By 1946, American authorities had established nearly 400 schools for dependents across occupied Japan. Children were not just visitors. They were being educated, raised, and socialized inside the defeated empire. For civilians who had lost their own schools to bombs, the sight of shiny classrooms filled with foreign children became both envy and fascination. One eyewitness recalled, asterisk, we watched and learned a new way of living. Asterisk. Civilians noticed details American children brushing teeth with store-bought paste, eating sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, carrying toys made of plastic, a material still rare in Japan. Each act became a small lesson in abundance and modernity. The humiliation of defeat remained, but curiosity grew alongside it. For some, watching the conqueror's children felt like glimpsing the future through a crack in the ruins. Markets revealed the starkest contrast. Japanese mothers haggled for scraps, while American families bought from PX stalls, stocked with chocolate and canned fruit. Yet over time, some civilians realized that this steady flow of goods also stabilized their city. Black markets thrived on discarded rations, and local children occasionally received candy from foreign hands. The wall between occupier and occupied had not crumbled, but it had begun to bend. That bending would grow stronger still, as fascination with American habits turned into something deeper, a slow shift in identity sparked by exchanges between children on both sides of the rubble. Years after the surrender, Tokyo's ruins had been rebuilt, but memories lingered. For many civilians, one sound from 1945 never faded, the laughter of American children echoing in streets of ash. It was remembered as both a humiliation and a strange rebirth. In diaries and testimonies, the detail returned again and again. Not the roar of planes or the crash of bombs, but the giggle of children who did not belong there, children whose innocence cut deeper than steel. Elders often described the moment in simple words, asterisk. That sound told us the war was truly over. Asterisk. One survivor recalled decades later. For him, it marked the instant when the empire's illusions collapsed. Flags had been lowered, treaties signed, but only when foreign children laughed in Tokyo's rubble did he believe defeat was absolute. The sting was sharp, and it left scars long after the rubble was cleared. Yet in that sting lay the seeds of transformation. Over time, the bitterness softened, giving way to recognition. Those children had not come to mock, but to live. Symbols of a nation powerful enough to protect its youth while waging a global war. Their presence revealed a truth Japan could not deny. Survival and future were possible even after devastation. Statistics tell the arc of that change. By 1952, only 7 years after surrender, Japan had signed a peace treaty and entered into an alliance with the United States. A city once reduced to ashes had become the center of reconstruction, fueled in part by American aid and technology. What began as humiliation grew into partnership, a shift that astonished even those who had lived through the worst.